Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you that I haven't met, I'm Melanie Wooden, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, and it's wonderful to reconnect with some of you that I met before and to meet other new faces. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, I'd like to welcome you all to the inaugural Jackman Annual Lecture in the Humanities. The JHI created this lecture series to celebrate its years of achievement and to recognize its fiercest supporter, the Honourable Hal Jackman, who has had unwavering support not only for the JHI, but for the University of Toronto. Hal is unfortunately unable to join us tonight, but I'd ask you in joining me in a round of applause in thanking Hal for all of his support. Tonight will be the first of many discussions about intriguing ideas and thought-provoking questions in art, history, literature, and philosophy. And I'm delighted to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Thomas Hurka. In his research, Tom, who is a university professor in philosophy here at U of T and a Jackman Distinguished Chair in Philosophical Studies, seeks to uncover and understand distinctively human traits and tendencies. An expert in moral and political philosophy, Tom has written extensively about perfectionism, as well as virtue, vice, and value. He shares his discoveries with non-academic audiences too. In his book, The Best Things in Life, Tom writes about the many things: pleasure, knowledge, achievement, virtue, personal love that can make your life more fulfilling. Tom, I'm going to read that book. In other words, he's an expert on how to live the good life. Tonight, he'll be speaking about games, what they are, and the connection between playing games, achievement, and a desirable human life. Following this, Alison Keith, director of the Jackman Humanities Institute, will moderate a Q&A session. I can't wait to learn more. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be giving the first in what I'm sure will be a long and prestigious series of lectures in honor of Hal Jackman. I should say in 2014-15, I spent a rewarding year as a faculty research fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute, and since 2003, I've been a Jackman Distinguished Professor of Philosophical Studies. So I've benefited personally twice from Hal's generosity, and I'm honored to be able to help express the gratitude of the Institute and of all the humanities departments in the Faculty of Arts and Science to Hal and Maruha for their tremendous contributions to humanities research and teaching at the University of Toronto. They've been on our side through the years, and we're deeply grateful to them. I've chosen to talk about the philosophy of games for a couple of reasons. The annual theme at the Institute the year I was a fellow was humor, play, and games, and my own work there was about games. In addition, I hope to show how philosophical attention to what may seem a minor topic can generate insights into larger and more significant ones about, for example, a good human life. So my initial question is what games are, or what features they have in common that make them games. On the face of it, games can differ a lot from each other. Sudoku is very different from football, which is different from mountain climbing, which is different from golf, poker, and Monopoly. But if these are all games, or if we think of them all as games, shouldn't there be something they have in common that explains why we classify them together as games? Well, you might say they're all enjoyable, but lots of things are enjoyable that aren't games, and some games are downright boring. So if there's a commonality to games, it has to be something different. Now, the question I've asked is one in what philosophers call conceptual analysis, which in its classical form aims to give logically necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of some concept, saying, for example, that anything that falls under concept A has properties B, C, and D, and anything with B, C, and D is A. To be A then just is to be B, C, and D. A simple analysis of this kind says that anyone who's a bachelor is a human being, male and unmarried, and any unmarried male human is a bachelor. To be a bachelor just is to have those three properties. Now, bachelor is way too simple a concept to be interesting, but philosophers have proposed analyses of more complex ones, such as those, for example, such as that of knowledge. So to know a proposition P, you must presumably believe it. P has to be true, and you arguably need good grounds for believing it, such as strong evidence for P. But there are lots of cases of evidence-based true belief that don't seem to count as knowledge. So philosophers have asked what other conditions have to be added to yield a successful analysis of knowledge, or whether some entirely different approach is needed. Another complex concept is that of cause. What exactly is involved in the claim that A caused B? For example, is something about necessity always implied? And if it is, what kind of necessity? So conceptual analysis has been part of philosophy from its inception, and in the mid-20th century, a good number of philosophers took it to be the central method of philosophy, whose main task they held is to help us understand certain concepts, key concepts we use in thinking about the world by giving them analyses of the above classical kind. Now, some of these philosophers would give their analyses a linguistic cast, so they were of the meaning of a word like know or cause, hence the so-called linguistic or ordinary language philosophy of that period. But to me, it's better to see them as analyzing concepts that our language sometimes well, but sometimes not so well expresses. However, in the 1950s, the whole idea of conceptual analysis came under several strands of attack, one of them due to Ludwig Wittgenstein, perhaps the century's most influential philosopher. He argued that with the exception of some simple concepts like bachelor, most of our concepts don't have the neat, necessary, and sufficient conditions a classical analysis aims to provide, i.e., for most interesting concept A, there's nothing like a shared set of properties B, C, and D, such that everything that has A has B, C, and D, and everything that has B, C, and D is A. And interestingly for us, the main concept he used to illustrate his argument was that of a game. Consider, for example, he wrote in a famous bit of his book, The Philosophical Investigations, consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common, or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there's anything common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see anything that's common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. End of quote. So as Wittgenstein saw it, there's nothing common to all games, which are instead linked by a set of what he called family resemblances. So the members of a family may look in various ways all alike, but there's no single physical trait or even set of traits that they all share. So a son may have his father's nose and his mother's chin while sharing his sister's voice and a cousin's walk. Similarly, Wittgenstein argued, what different pairs of games have in common is different. What Sudoku shares with football is different from what football shares with mountain climbing, which in turn is different from what makes golf similar to poker or poker to Monopoly. Instead of a single nature or essence of game, there's an open-ended set of similarities that, in his words, overlap and crisscross, just like a family's similarities in appearance do. There's no one thing or even set of things that makes any game a game, but different things for different games. So this claim that game is a family resemblance concept has been extremely influential. When I was a philosophy student in the 1970s, it was widely assumed that Wittgenstein had conclusively proved that there's no common essence to all games. And that view is still often repeated, both in books by philosophers and in work by non-philosophers. I have to say that when I was a student, I wasn't persuaded. I mean, it's not that I had some neat set of necessary and sufficient conditions for playing a game clearly in my mind, but I didn't see how those very brief remarks of Wittgenstein's that I quoted showed that there couldn't be one. And then one day I was presented with one. It was 1979, my first year teaching at the University of Calgary, and we had a lecture by a visiting philosopher I hadn't heard of, Bernard Suits from the University of Waterloo. Unbeknownst to me, he had just published a book with the University of Toronto Press called The Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia that gives an analysis of game of just the kind that Wittgenstein said is impossible. And his lecture to us addressed criticism of that analysis in a review of the book in the University of Toronto Quarterly by John Hunter, a Toronto philosophy professor who was a devotee of Wittgenstein. To do so, however, Suits had to give his analysis of what it is to play a game, which has the following three parts. So in playing a game, Suits says, is that going up? Okay. You first aim at a goal that can be understood and achieved apart from the game. So in golf, you try and make it the case that a ball goes into a hole in the ground. In mountain climbing, you try to make it the case that you stand on top of a mountain. And in the 200-meter sprint at the Olympics, you try to make it the case that you cross a line on the track before any of 7 other competitors do. Second, the game has rules. And what the rules do is forbid you to use the most efficient means to that goal. So in golf, you're not permitted to pick the ball up by hand, walk down the fairway, and drop it into the hole. In mountain climbing, you're not permitted to take a helicopter up to the top of the mountain. And in the 200-meter sprint, there's all sorts of things you're not permitted to do. You may not cut across the infield. It's the 200 sprint, not the 100. You're not permitted to cut across the infield, start before your competitors do, or knock them down if they try to pass you. In all these cases, you have to pursue your goal within the rules of the game, which means in less than the most efficient way possible. So that's 2 conditions, but they're not sufficient for you to be playing a game. So think of a farmer who's harvesting his crop by hand because he can't afford a combine harvester, which would be more efficient and he would much prefer to be using. He isn't playing a game. So there's a third condition, which is a condition on your attitude. To be playing a game, Suit says, you have to accept the limitations the rules impose because you want to play the game. Or as I would put it, you accept the limitations the rules impose because you want to engage in the activity of pursuing the goal by only the means the rules allow. Thus, a golfer doesn't wish he could drop the ball in the hole by hand. He wants to get it there by golfing. Nor would a mountain climber accept a helicopter ride if one were available. He wants to reach the peak by climbing. Both have what Suits calls the losery attitude. That's a word he made up, losery from the Latin ludus, game, or ludere, to play a game. Anyways, both have what Suits calls the losery attitude, which is one of willingly accepting the restrictions the rules of a game impose. So to play a game is to pursue a goal while happily accepting certain prohibitions on efficient means to that goal. In Suits' elegant summary, that's the quote at the bottom, playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. The voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. I should add one thing. What I've called the initial goal, Suits called the pre-losery goal. That's getting the ball be in a hole in the ground in golf. That's a goal, it is pre-losery because it can be understood and achieved apart from the game. But he recognized that you also have a goal internal to the game, which he called the losery goal, and which most abstractly is just winning. So when you're playing a game, you're trying to win. But what is it to win? To win is just to achieve the pre-losery goal in the ways that the rules allow. So in the 200-meter sprint, it's to cross the finish line before the other sprinters, having done so only by running and not starting before they do and staying in your lane and so on. And in match play golf, to win the 13th hole is to get your ball in the hole in fewer strokes than your competitor while using only 14 clubs and playing the ball where it lies and so on. So there's no need to add a reference to winning to the analysis. Winning is just analyzed as achieving the goal by only the ways the rules allow. And you don't have to say that you're aiming to win, because if you're aiming at the goal only by ways the rules allow, that just is to aim at winning. Anyways, that's the analysis that was presented at this lecture in 1979. And when I heard it, I thought, that's fantastic. I hope you think it's fantastic. The analysis explains the familiar idea of what it is to play a game in terms that aren't familiar, in that they're not consciously present to our minds when we think about games, but that seem to fit the way we decide what is and isn't a game. It's therefore illuminating in the way a conceptual analysis at its best is supposed to be. And it's totally consistent with the many differences between games that I described at the start and that Wittgenstein was emphasizing when he talked about board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games. Because different games can have different initial goals or pre-losery goals. In one, a ball's being in a hole in the ground. In another, you're standing on a mountain. In others, arrangement of pieces on a chessboard or of playing cards in your hand. And the rules restricting the means to these goals can likewise be different. But there'll always be some goal and some rules and the same attitude, illusory attitude of accepting the rules in order to make the game possible. So this analysis that Bernie Suits presented is structural. It's finding a deeper or more abstract unity beneath the surface diversity of games. So it's like what linguists do when they find, say, the same subject-predicate sentence structure in languages that indicate subject and predicate in very different ways. And it means that Wittgenstein's argument, which doesn't consider the possibility of a structural analysis, is frankly embarrassingly superficial. On this topic, at least, it's the little-known Waterloo professor who's thinking profoundly and the giant of 20th century thought who's stuck on the surface. And the analysis is also beautiful. So it doesn't equate a concept A with a mere conjunction of independent elements B, C, and D, the way the analysis of Batchelor does. Instead, its elements are all connected to each other. The third element, the illusory attitude, is an attitude to the rules. And the rules, the third element, the illusory attitude, refers to the second, the rules, since an attitude to the rules. And the second element refers to the first, since the rules restrict means to the goal. So its elements are kind of unified or nested within each other. And you know, if physicists value beautiful physical theories and mathematicians prefer elegant mathematical proofs, I think philosophers should welcome beautiful conceptual analyses. Just one caveat, the analysis doesn't show, nor did Suits ever suggest that it does, that Wittgenstein was wrong on his larger point. It may show that it may be that many of our other concepts, including perhaps knowledge and cause, can't be given neat, necessary, and sufficient conditions, but involve only family resemblances. But you know, game, that was Wittgenstein's own example. Nobody forced it on him, and that there seems to be a lovely analysis of it. So actually, it took a while after the lecture before I went and read Suits's book, and I have to say I was again amazed because. Yeah, there it is. That's a third edition, because it's kind of a literary masterpiece. It's not written as a standard academic book, but is an affectionate parody of a dialogue of Plato, with the Socrates role played by the grasshopper from Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper. So just as Socrates in the Republic is asked probing questions by two young friends who in the end accept his answer, so Suits's grasshopper has a similar interchange with two young insect friends. Several of the Platonic dialogues are set after Socrates has been condemned to death, which his friends say he can escape by leaving Athens. And Socrates refuses, saying that would mean giving up philosophical discussion, which he considers the best thing anyone can do. As he famously puts it, the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, the grasshopper too faces death, since unlike the ant, who worked all summer to store food for the winter, he played games and now has nothing. But when his friends suggest a way to survive that involves doing some work, he likewise refuses, saying it would mean giving up playing games, which he says is the intrinsically best activity possible. As he might put it, the ungame-playing life is not worth living. And there's a further parallel. By the way, if you don't get these parallels, it doesn't matter. But if you do, they're lovely. There's a further parallel. A Platonic dialogue often starts with a question, such as, can virtue be taught, or is acting justly to your advantage? Which Socrates typically says we can't answer unless we first settle the analytical question, what is virtue or what is justice? And Suits's book likewise starts with the grasshopper's claim that game playing is the intrinsically best activity, or constitutes what he calls the ideal of existence, but then it has a long central section giving its analysis of gameplay. And only when that's in hand does it return to the claim about the value of games, which it uses the analysis to defend. So that's just like the structure of a Socratic dialogue. The book is also full of witty turns of phrase and whimsical illustrative examples, which I might share in the Q&A, but it is just a kind of unique piece of philosophical writing. So I gave you a little analysis. It's back up there, and you might have criticisms of it that came to your mind. So one of them is that the analysis doesn't fit a game like chess, where your goal of checkmate can't be understood apart from the game, as the goals of golf and mountain climbing can, but is defined in terms of the rules of golf. Here, Suits grants that checkmate is defined by some of the rules of chess, but says it's independent of others. So that just as you can put a ball in a golf hole without golfing, so you can create a checkmate pattern on a chessboard without having played a game of chess. That's because the game has other rules that say how you have to pursue checkmate. By moving your pieces only in a certain way and in alternation with an opponent's moves. You can't take 2 moves to his 1. And not by knocking his pieces off the board or gluing to spaces on the chessboard. Once it's recognized that a game can have different kinds of rules, the analysis does, I think, fit chess. Another criticism is that many activities the analysis does fit aren't commonly called games. Though mountain climbing and sprinting are among Suits's leading examples, mountain climbing isn't usually called a game. And as Hunter said in his review, we talk of the 200-meter race, but not the 200-meter game. In his response to Hunter, Suits said that as far as he could recall, the 200 meters is part of the Olympic something or others. Moreover, both climbing and sprinting are called sports, which are pretty close to games. More importantly, though, Suits said he wasn't analyzing the meaning of the English word game, as a linguistic philosopher might. He was analyzing games, the things themselves, regardless of what they're called. He was analyzing items in the world rather than anything about our language. That puts the response kind of metaphysically, but it can also be made in terms of concepts. Imagine that there's no unifying concept B, C, and D that precisely fits everything that's standardly called a game and nothing that's not. There is, however, a concept of this kind that fits 90% of the things that are called games and just a few that aren't. Would it be reasonable to say this B, C, and D concept is totally uninteresting because it doesn't exactly fit our current word game? I don't think that would be reasonable. You know, the ordinary language philosophers that I mentioned tended to assume that the meanings of our English words always pick out the most useful concepts for understanding the world, which is why they thought philosophy should attend to these words. But why think anything as random and unguided by philosophy as the development of an everyday language will always have that result? Can I tell a joke about ordinary language philosophy? So they really did believe that if English had 2 words in a certain area, then there must be some important distinction that was being indicated by these 2 words. In a very entertaining article published in 1967, it's a very strange thing to say about English, because English famously has 2 roots, a Latin Romance root and a Germanic root. And so there often are 2 words, one with one origin, one with the other. So it seems that there's a cat on the mat. It appears that there's a cat on the mat. What's the important difference between those 2? And he also said, if you want to say that somebody isn't mentally quite with it, you would say, he's out of his mind, but off of his head. Now, what's the significance of the fact that it's off with head and out with mind? Anyway, so I don't think we should assume that the English language is a perfect guide to the most useful concepts we can use. It's possible that a concept that's not exactly coextensive with an existing English word is more useful and illuminating than one that is, and I think that's true of Suits's concept of game. Even if it doesn't fit everything we call a game, it fits some things we don't, it can be a better and more explanatory concept to use. And one reason is just that it explains why it makes sense to classify the activities it fits together. They all involve a goal, rules forbidding efficient means to that goal, and an attitude to those rules. But it's also because Suits's analysis of game illuminates other issues, just as Socrates thought analyses of virtue and justice can help us settle whether virtue can be taught or justice is advantageous. And the principal issue I want to talk about concerns a value found not only in gameplay, but also more generally in our lives. So what, I want to ask, more specifically do a game's rules do? By forbidding the most efficient means to a goal, they make realizing that goal more difficult than it would otherwise be. And in many cases, they make realizing it by absolute standards difficult. There are, however, different senses of difficult here. In simple games such as Go Fish and Rock, Paper, Scissors, or in games of chance like bingo and roulette, the rules make realizing the goal more difficult only in the sense that they make it less probable, not in any sense that requires skill, effort, or extensive practice. But when Suits's grasshopper says playing games is the best activity, he can't have games like these in mind. He can't be suggesting that an ideal human life could be one spent playing Go Fish or bingo. He must have in mind more serious games, ones whose rules make success difficult in a sense that does require developed skill, games like chess, golf, mountain climbing, hockey, and more. And playing these games, at least at a sufficiently high level, is indeed widely regarded, I think, as valuable. We don't think someone who spends years practicing to become a world champion chess master or golfer is wasting their time, any more than we think practicing to become a skilled musician or painter is a waste. On the contrary, outstanding chess players and athletes are admired and given honors, such as election to a Hall of Fame or to the Order of Canada. And something similar is true at more modest levels. Those of us who will never be world champions can think it's worth practicing to improve our chess or golf games, just as it is to get better at our music or painting, and we can rightfully feel some pride when we do improve. That's because success in serious games involves a more abstract value that I'll call achievement. In achievement, are we ready for that one? In achievement, you set yourself a goal and actively pursue it. Your pursuit of the goal is competent, which means you choose means to it that have a high or the highest available probability of realizing it, and you choose them because they have that probability. And then you do successfully realize the goal. In short, you competently and successfully pursue a goal. And what makes some achievements more valuable than others, or more worth admiring or taking pride in, is, I suggest, their difficulty. Thus, climbing Mount Everest is a greater and more valuable achievement than successfully tying a shoelace because it's more difficult, and winning a major golf tournament is more impressive than crossing the street, again, because it's harder. Now, difficulty here, or in more than the sense involved in a game of chance, can have several different elements. I mean, different things can make an activity difficult. Sometimes realizing a goal is difficult because it's not obvious what the most effective means to it are, so it takes trained skill to identify what those are. For example, to see which chess move will lead to checkmate or which pass to a teammate can result in a goal now. Sometimes it turns on the complexity of the plan or strategy you need to realize the goal, or the number of subordinate goals it involves and the complexity of the relations between them. Thus, chess is more difficult, and I would say more valuable than checkers, because it demands more complex strategic thinking, with this complexity greater at higher levels of chess play. I mean, at the Grand Master level, the strategies they're carrying out are way more complex than ordinary chess players' strategies. Sometimes difficulty is a matter of the precision of the goals you have to realize, such as hitting an approach shot in golf not just somewhere near the green, but close to the pin, or making your pass in hockey at the precise moment your teammate is open and putting it not just somewhere near him, but right on his stick. And often difficulty combines all these elements. So realizing your primary goal requires realizing a complex series of precise subordinate ones that it takes skill to identify and that have to be realized in a precise order. And the difficulty is greater if the subordinate goals are of varied types, so you need different skills to realize them. So achievement, as so understood, can be found in many activities other than games. It's an achievement if a medical researcher finds, through a complex series of innovative experiments, a cure for cancer, as it was also an achievement when physicists built a Large Hadron Collider and ran experiments on it to confirm the existence of the Higgs boson. It can be an achievement if a general leads a military campaign to victory, or when a politician engages in complex negotiations to secure passage of an important law. There can also be more everyday achievements, when you raise a child, tend a garden, or comfort a troubled friend. In fact, whenever you competently pursue a complex or difficult goal and successfully realize it. And though he doesn't put it this way, the value of achievement is what Suits's grasshopper is defending when he argues that game playing is, quote, the ideal of existence. How does he do that? He asks us to imagine a utopia. Remember the book's called Games, Life, and Utopia. Ask us to imagine a utopia where all instrumental needs, or needs for means to your goal, are effortlessly satisfied, so you never have to work to fulfill them. If you want a beautiful house with many rooms, great art, and an ocean view, you just snap your fingers and you have it. If you want complete scientific understanding of the laws of the universe, you connect telepathically to a big computer and the understanding is yours. In this utopia, anything its inhabitants want can be instantaneously there. What, the grasshopper asks, will they then do? In utopia, how will they spend their time? He suggests that they'll eventually decide that though they could get a beautiful house by snapping their fingers, it would be more interesting because more of a challenge to build it in the old-fashioned way by pouring a foundation, framing, and drywalling. So some of them do that. Though they could just connect to a big computer, some will try to see if they can discover the laws of the universe on their own by doing experiments, again because it's more challenging. But in doing these things, the grasshopper says, they'll in effect be making a game out of house building or gaining knowledge. They'll be preferring a less efficient means to a house or to scientific understanding because it's less efficient, and will therefore be displaying the losery attitude and playing a game, in particular what I call a serious game. That's why, in his view, game playing is the ideal of existence. It's what people in ideal utopian conditions would primarily do. They would erect unnecessary obstacles to goals they could realize more easily and then try to realize them in a more challenging way. But if their attitude is one of preferring a more difficult route to a goal, it's also one of preferring a greater to a lesser achievement and thus of seeking achievement as such. So I think that's actually a pretty neat question to ask. If you lived in a world where all your instrumental needs, you never had any need for something as a means to an end, what would you do? You'd never be seeking means to some end. Anything you did, you'd have to want to do for its own sake, because you valued it for its own sake. And the suggestion is you would do these things in complicated ways because that would be a challenge, and that's in effect to play a game. Now, I think the argument here is a bit exaggerated. If the grasshopper's aim is to show that game playing or achievement is the single greatest human good, he stacks the deck by asking what people in his utopia will do. For there can be states of being, not doing, therein that are also valuable. If they enjoy constant ecstatic pleasure or joy, that's surely a good thing, even if it's not an activity or something they do. Likewise, if they have extensive scientific knowledge, that can be good, even if they acquired the knowledge effortlessly. But the grasshopper's argument does more modestly highlight achievement as one significant human good among others. What's gained, though, by stating the argument in terms of games, if achievement is also possible outside games? Well, even if gameplay isn't the only or most valuable instance of achievement, it's the purest and best illustration of it, and so brings it out in the clearest possible way. In many other achievements, your goal either is itself of significant value or will lead to something of significant value. That makes the achievement good instrumentally or because of its effects, and that can overshadow and obscure the value it has intrinsically or in itself as the successful doing of something difficult. So if you find a cure for cancer, that will save millions of people from suffering and early death, which is surely more important and far more noticeable than the fact that you completed a difficult task. If your experiments confirm the existence of an elementary particle, that will increase many people's knowledge and can stimulate further experiments that lead to yet more knowledge. Winning a war, that was the example of a general, can prevent successful aggression and perhaps genocide. In all these cases, the value of what's achieved through an activity can outweigh and obscure the value the achievement has in itself. But in gameplay, your goal is completely trivial. There's no value in itself in a ball's being in a hole in the ground, or in your standing atop a mountain, or you're crossing a line on a track before other people do. In these cases, there's no value in what's achieved, which means the intrinsic value of the achievement stands out more clearly as the only significant value present. Though not the only instance of achievement, gameplay is what I've called its purest illustration, because in it achievement occurs on its own with nothing else to distract from or obscure its value. And gameplay illustrates especially clearly the kind of value achievement is. If your goal in a game is valueless, the value of your playing the game can't depend on the value of the goal. It must instead be entirely a matter of the way you pursue and realize the goal. To use some cliches, I was saying familiar phrases, come on, let's be honest. To use some cliches, it must be entirely a matter of process, not product, journey, not destination. But right, it has to be a matter not of what you achieve, but of what the process was like of achieving it. Why? Because what you achieve, considered itself, a ball in a hole in the ground, is completely trivial. And because it's a value, as I say, of process, not product, journey, not destination, to me that makes a distinctively modern value as against a classical view expressed, for example, by Aristotle. At the start of his Nicomachean Ethics, immensely influential, excessively influential book, Aristotle says that if an activity has a goal that's external to it, the activity can't have more value than its goal does. By an external goal, he means one that's separate from the activity of pursuing it and brings the activity to an end. And the initial goals of games are all in this way external. When you're on top of Mount Everest, you're no longer climbing it, and once you've checkmated an opponent, your game with him is over. So what you aim at in a game is a result that's outside the process of pursuing it, in the sense that the process and the realization occur at different times. But then, given Aristotle's view, there can't be any value in playing games, since their external goals are trivial. And there can't more generally be any value in achievement as I've described it, or any value that depends only on the difficulty of realizing a goal and not on what the goal is. Of course, there are achievements whose goals do have value, such as finding a cure for cancer, and those achievements can have value that derives from their goal. But they can't have the distinctive value I've described, and that's equally present in activities with valueless goals. In consequence, achievement doesn't figure in classical theories of value such as Aristotle's and the many influenced by him. Something like it does appear in the more modern theories of Marx and Nietzsche, who valued respectively transforming nature through productive labor and exercising one's will in the world, both of which are, more abstractly, forms of achievement. But many philosophical theories have omitted it, and therefore have omitted a good that's both important and, I think, widely recognized in everyday thought. I want to highlight one instance of this good, but we'll first notice a further way Suit's analysis of gameplay illuminates how playing games can be valuable. It concerns the third element in the analysis, the losery attitude. So I said this attitude involves accepting the rules of the game because you want to pursue its goal in only the ways that they allow. But you can do this from different motives or for different reasons, and there can therefore be different, more specific specifications, more specific descriptions of what the losery attitude is. So a permissive description, very permissive description, doesn't care what your motive is. It says that so long as you accept the rules, you have the losery attitude and are playing a game. A more restrictive description says you have to do so because you want to engage in the activity of pursuing the goal in only the ways they allow for its own sake, and not just as a means to something else. And a yet more restrictive description says you must want to engage in that activity for the specific reason that it'll be difficult, or in the case of a serious game, will present a challenge you want to meet. So Suits doesn't explicitly distinguish these possibilities, but at 2 points he assumes the third, most restrictive version of the losery attitude. One is in his account of utopia, where people build houses in the old-fashioned way or try to learn scientific laws by doing experiments precisely because it'll be challenging. They choose to do something difficult because it's difficult. And the second comes when he explains how game rules differ from moral rules. Because some moral rules, after all, also forbid the use of what may be efficient means. They say you mustn't lie, steal, or kill, even if that will further a goal you have. And they can say this even if your goal is a good one. Thus, the morality of war says that even if you're fighting an unjust enemy, one it would be good and virtuous to defeat, you mustn't do so by directing lethal force at civilians or targeting civilians. If a general fighting a just war accepts this restriction, he's going to pursue the goal of victory, but avoid targeting civilians, avoid using that efficient means. He's surely not playing a game. Why is he not playing a game? Suits actually gives a number of answers, but one is that someone who obeys a moral rule doesn't do so because it provides, quote, an interesting challenge. He doesn't do so with the most restrictive version of the losery attitude. He's not saying, I'm not going to target civilians because I want to see if I can win without doing that, even though it would be easier to do it. That's not his motivation. So I think the most restrictive version of the losery attitude has to be the one that figures in the analysis. Now, this attitude can't be necessary for an individual to be playing a game. It's not necessary for you to be playing a game that you have that attitude. So consider what I'll call a pure professional golfer who plays golf only as a means to making money and with no interest in the game for its own sake. If he found out that he could make more money doing something other than playing golf, he'd switch in an instant. If he thought he could make money by cheating at golf, he'd happily cheat. He just knows that there's TV cameras everywhere at a golf tournament, and any attempt to cheat will be caught. So he plays by the rules of golf because and only because that's necessary for making money. So he doesn't have the restrictive version of the losery attitude. He's not obeying the rules because he wants to do something difficult, but surely he's still playing golf. The reason I suggest is that although he doesn't have the restrictive losery attitude, most other people who play golf do. I mean, most golfers play partly or largely because of the challenge. So for your activity to be a game, either you yourself or most people who engage in the activity, those are alternatives, must accept the rules because they make the activity more difficult. And that means that most serious gameplay is valuable in a further way beyond its involving a difficult achievement. Could I just give you another example? Well, I actually gave you a talk about this many years ago, and somebody in the question period asked, is writing an exam a game? Is writing a university physics exam a game? Because after all, you're trying to get the right answers, and you accept rules that say you can't check the internet, you can't look at the textbook, you can't copy from your neighbor. And I actually emailed Suits, and he said, yes, it is a game. I don't think he should have said that. And I would say the reason is that you're not obeying the rules because you want to meet an interesting challenge. Nor do most people who write physics exams obey the rules because they want to meet an interesting challenge. You can ask your students if you're giving them an exam. But consider the case of Trivial Pursuit. Now, Trivial Pursuit has exactly the same goal and the same rules. You're trying to come up with the right answer to a question, and you can't Google it, and you can't bring the whole Encyclopedia Britannica with you to the bar. But Trivial Pursuit is a game because most people play it because it's a challenge. And it would be a game even if somebody was a pure professional Trivial Pursuit player. He played only as a means to money. Why would it be a game? Because most people do it with the restrictive version of the losery attitude. Anyway, so my idea is that if gameplay involves this restrictive version of the losery attitude, it's valuable for another reason. So according to what I at least think is an attractive theory, wanting something that's good for its own sake or for the properties that make it good is another good thing and constitutes a moral virtue. So if somebody else's happiness is a good thing, and you want their happiness as an end in itself, your wanting their happiness is another good thing and is virtuous, and it's an instance of the virtue of benevolence. And it's likewise good and virtuous to want to prevent something bad. So if somebody else is feeling pain is bad, and you want to prevent them being in pain, and you try to prevent them from being in pain, and you're upset and pained if they're in pain, those are all cases of, that's also good and virtuous. But it's vicious and bad to want something bad like another person's pain, or to want to destroy a good like her pleasure. More generally abstractly, it's good when an attitude's orientation, either positive or negative, matches the value, positive or negative, of its object, and it's bad when its orientation opposes that of its object. So I sometimes call this the car battery theory of moral virtue and vice, because if you're boosting your car battery, you have to connect the positive terminal to the positive terminal and the negative terminal to the negative terminal. So according to this theory, positive, positive, and negative, negative combinations have positive value, but positive, negative, negative, positive are trouble. Or to quote an important philosophical text, the children's book Madeline. Do you all know the children's book Madeline about there were 12 little girls in 2 straight lines? And what it said about them is they smiled at the good and frowned at the bad. I would say they had a positive attitude to a positive value and a negative attitude to a negative value, and that was virtuous and good. Okay, but if difficult achievement, as in a serious game, is good, then wanting it because it's difficult is an instance of wanting something that's good for the property that makes it good, and so is a further good and virtuous. So alongside the good of achievement, there is, in most serious gameplay, the further good of wanting and seeking achievement for itself. It's a kind of icing on the cake. But this further good depends on the prior fact that achievement is good, and that, I've said, is something that classical theories like Aristotle's omit, which means that they omit some intuitively valuable activities. Now, Danny, you don't want to listen to this part. Consider, for instance, economic or business activity. Say that of founding a company and making it grow and be successful. That involves many of the aspects of difficulty I described, such as identifying effective means to a goal when those aren't obvious, and executing a complex strategy with precise and varied parts involving, say, production, marketing, and finance. And just like serious gameplay, it can have the value of achievement, even if its goal, say that of selling more product than that of some rival company, more Coke than Pepsi, more iPhones than BlackBerries, is intrinsically valueless. Now, unlike gameplay, business activity often has significant further effects. On the one side, it can create new products that make people's lives safer or more enjoyable. On the other, it can exploit workers, deceive consumers, and heighten economic inequality. These are vital and hotly debated effects, but I'm going to leave their assessment to economists and political scientists. I note only what in the larger scheme of things may be less important, but is still present, the intrinsic value business activity can have as a successful completion of a difficult project. And I think this is a value recognized in everyday thought. As a child, I heard people in my family's social circle speak admiringly of someone as a good businessman, which I take it meant one good at making and implementing business distinctions. And there's more formal and public recognition of these qualities. Just as there are hockey and baseball halls of fame, so there's a Canadian Business Hall of Fame, to which I note Hal Jackman was elected in 2002. So I don't know, I wish he were here, though I don't know whether he'd appreciate the comparison. He's the business equivalent of a 500 goal scorer or a multiple Cy Young Award winning pitcher. But this value is one classical theories omit and that Aristotle explicitly denied. Appealing to his view that an activity with an external goal can't have more value than its goal does, he said that since possessing money has no value, the activity of pursuing it, as in a money-making life, also has no value. Thus, again, ignoring any value of process not product, journey not destination. Now, you may be inclined to deny that business people usually have the restrictive version of the losery attitude, that of wanting to do something difficult because it's difficult, that can give serious gameplay the additional value of a positive orientation to something good. Instead, you may think, most business people care only, as Aristotle assumed, about money or profits. Well, even if that were true, business activity could still have the initial value of difficult achievement, and actually I'm not sure that it is true. I suspect many business people are motivated, at least in part, by enjoyment of the challenges business activity poses, and there have been recently a number of writings by business people that say this, and that say it with explicit reference to the grasshopper and its analysis of games. So one of these appeared in a well-known magazine in 2015. So its author was somebody who worked at a small software company that investors had given $40 million on terms that meant its employees would benefit only if they grew the company's market capitalization to $1 billion. I think they had a certain number of years. Here's $40 million. If you're up to $1 billion market capitalization at the end of that period, that's great. We all get rich. If you haven't, game over. You can go home. So this investment completely changed the employees' conditions of work. Instead of kind of gradually and lazily improving its website, they were now under pressure to do things faster and better, and then even faster and even better. Noting how getting a large check made, quote, the day's idle task seem to suddenly matter, the author says, maybe all it did was complicate a perfectly pleasant game. And then he gives the analysis of games from the grasshopper that we might have back up, Kim. It's hard to admit, he says, that work is nothing more than a Seussian game, one in which the score is kept in dollars. We take our jobs too seriously to admit that jobs are more or less a series of arbitrary obstacles. We don't take them seriously enough to realize just how much of ourselves we give to them. If we're serious about how we're spending our time alive, we should pick the job that offers the game we most like to play, the one whose goals and rules we most believe in. A capitalist economy, he continues, gives one harder problems, but, quote, that turns out to be the saving grace, because harder problems make for better games. If you imagine a job without any stress, a game with no stakes, you're imagining a game you quit. $40 million is a ticket to a game almost no one gets to play, the privilege to be stupidly ambitious. When you work for a website and you say, we're going to become an indelible part of the culture, you are deluded, but it's one of the best delusions money can buy. So I assume that this author is unusual in having the Seussian losery attitude as his only or main motive for business activity. Most business people, I suspect, care also a great deal about the financial rewards business success can bring. Moreover, some and even many may have less attractive elements in their attitudes, such as indifference to the effects of what they do on competitors who can be driven out of business or on consumers who they induce to spend their money in wasteful ways. I mean, that indifference is positively vicious. It's not virtuous. So the idea isn't that business people are always paragons of virtue. And they're also, and often more importantly, the further effects of business activity, sometimes for good, the invention of new products, sometimes for bad, environmental degradation, exploitation of workers. I suspect, though, that many business people are motivated, at least in part, by a Seussian enjoyment of challenges. And whatever their motivation, their activity can involve the value of achievement or of successfully doing something difficult, and it can have that value even if its goal, such as, again, getting people to buy more Coke than Pepsi, or more iPhones than BlackBerries, is like the initial goal in a game, intrinsically trivial. Moreover, and as that author recognizes, that value comes up most clearly given an analysis of what gameplay is. Just to go back to philosophy's roots, Socrates thought we need an analytical understanding of what virtue and justice are in order to understand other important things about virtue and justice. So here I'm suggesting an analytical understanding of what games are highlights, perhaps surprisingly, what might otherwise be an underappreciated aspect of a good human life. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Hurka, for that entertaining and illuminating lecture. A difficult achievement at the best of times, and one that is valuable in both the academy, where we find ourselves, and I think in life.
I should add something. In writing his book, Suits was writing a game. I wish he hadn't said it in the book. He says it explicitly. It's the game of trying to write a philosophically substantive book about games in the form of a dialogue between insects that parodies the structure of a dialogue of Plato. Sorry.
Thank you. And may I say how much I enjoyed the Latin etymology and all the allusions to classical philosophy, just as a classicist. I know that many people will have questions and comments, so I want to open the floor. Yes.
Tom, so as you know, there are people who don't think that achievements require goals, or at least not in the same way. So suppose I'm going to climb a mountain, I desire to climb mountain A, that's my goal, but somebody has gone ahead of me and changed the sign so that I actually go towards mountain B. I climb it competently, it's difficult, I get to the top, and then I realize, oh, I was actually meaning to climb that one. So I haven't achieved my goal, and yet it still seems that my climbing mountain B is still an achievement. So what does your view say about that?
Well, I guess I would say, in that case, when you're at the bottom of mountain B, one of your goals was to climb that mountain. Now, you mistakenly thought it was mountain A, and it's actually mountain B. But you did have, among other things, the goal of achieving that mountain. And you did achieve that goal. So yes, I'm assuming that in achievement, you intend to realize some goal, and then you do it. And so there might be better examples where there's an achievement. So I think, isn't one of the examples the discovery of penicillin? So the discovery of penicillin was accidental. Fleming wasn't out to discover an antibiotic. Something was left in his, some mold, something was left in a petri dish, and he went away and he came back and it had that interesting mold, and he started figuring out what the mold was. Well, he didn't start out with the goal of discovering an antibiotic, but at a certain point he did have the goal of figuring out what this mold is and whether it would be interesting and scientifically important, and would it have medical implications. I mean, I think if what Fleming had done was just kicked over a vial, and somehow things mixed and popped up and it was penicillin, I don't think we'd call that an achievement, because it didn't involve any skill in pursuit of a goal. But Fleming did after the initial point. And of course, I said many achievements also have good effects and are valuable because of their effects. So something that you might not be pursuing a goal, But if you realize it completely accidentally, without even intending to climb that mountain, well, that might have lots of, beneficial consequences. So yeah, I mean, I recognize that's an alternative. I mean, I have this interest that achievement should be understood as a parallel to knowledge. And in knowledge, you have a belief that matches the world when it's true of the world. And on my understanding, achievement, you have a goal that you then realize in the world so that there's a match between your mind and the world, so things went in the opposite direction. It's not things were the way they are and you formed a belief that matched it. No, you had a goal in your mind and you transformed the world to match the goal in your mind. So that's kind of abstract, but that's, my thinking about achievement is based, on the idea that we should make this a kind of parallel to knowledge.
Go over here, front row.
Your title promised
Baseball.
illumination about baseball. That's right. It said almost nothing about baseball except the passing reference to Cy Young Awards. So I'm going to ask a baseball question.
Yeah.
And it's asked with, I think, a serious point, because what I'm wondering from baseball, it's difficult, at least I can't think of a way of identifying the goal of baseball except in a way that makes it rule dependent. If it's scoring more runs than the other team does, then the notion of a run is defined by the rules. But it led me to wonder, I mean, maybe that is the relevant goal, and the fact that it's rule dependent doesn't really make any difference. But baseball has a lot of other goals in it. To break it down to achievements that are not rule dependent, like hitting a ball over the fence. In the case of baseball, is baseball a game in which it's the overarching goal that matters, or is it a game with a plurality of goals that have a kind of structure or relationship to one another within the rules of the game, but some of which are rule dependent, others are not. Others can be understood completely independent of the rules.
So I would say baseball is a bit like chess, in that some of the goals are defined in terms of rules that define what a run is, define what a strike is, and so on. And then there are other rules about how you can get a run. To score a run, you have to touch home plate, having previously touched first base, second base, third base, and not having been tagged or anything else. Now, all those, what first base is, what tagging is, are all defined by some rules of the game. But it's like chess in that you define all these items, and then there are other rules that say what you have to do to get them. I would have thought that there is a single goal in baseball, which is over the course of 9 innings, score more runs than the other team scores. Now, to do that, you partly want to score as many runs as you can, and you want to prevent as many runs as you can, and those are things that you're doing at different times. But I would say that there was a single goal. But baseball is interesting. This is now inside baseball in two senses of the word. One of the things about baseball is that many of the things are defined by an umpire's decision. So something is a strike if the umpire says it's a strike. If the ball is 2 inches, off the plate, and the plate umpire says strike one, it's a strike. Now there are instructions.
Until they introduce ABS.
Pardon?
For now, until they introduce ABS.
That's right. But that's one of the things that's so. Anyways, and there are rules about. There's instructions to umpires about how they're to decide what's a ball and what's a strike. And if you're consistently calling pitches 2 inches outside the strike zone a strike, you're not going to be an umpire for very long. But if you do it, it's a strike. Now, one of Bernie Suits's claims was that if you don't play by the rules, if you cheat, you're not playing the game. That's, a very strict claim. And some people have said, what about all the baseball players who trap a ball in the outfield and then leap up saying, I caught it, or catchers who frame pitches, try to fool the umpire into thinking that it was a strike? Very important skill as you know. And people say, look, that's cheating, and according to suits, they're not playing baseball. But surely, when a pitcher catcher, but what I would say is something is a strike if the umpire says it's a strike. And there's no rule that says that baseball players can't try to influence an umpire's determination of what was a strike or what was a line drive caught in the outfield. And I don't know if this is the inside baseball part. When the baseball players union responds to the proposal to have basically robots called balls and strikes, they say that takes the skill out of the game. It takes out the skill of framing pitches and deluding the umpire into thinking that this was a strike when it was really off the plate. All I'm saying about that is it was not cheating, because there's no rule that says you can't try and trick the umpire. I'm sorry to go on, but baseball and other sports.
Something about baseball, I thought.
Yeah. But it's just an over and above checkmate. I mean, whether there's a checkmate, that's an objective fact. You don't have a referee come and say, oh, yeah, that's checkmate. But in sports like baseball, the rules are framed in terms of the decisions of umpires. And umpires are given instructions on how they should make those decisions, but those instructions aren't part of the rules.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I tend to go on.
That's wonderful. We'll have Ruby.
Thank you for these wonderful provocations. I very much, liked, I don't know whether you were emphasizing that via suits or it was your own assessment of things themselves.
Yes?
I like that very much. Nonetheless, I wanted to ask the question about the place of the players and the place of chance.
Mm-hmm.
I think something like when you mentioned almost in passing, you said tying your shoelace versus climbing the Everest, and I thought to myself, there's so much chance implicit in it. What if somebody is disabled, right? They can't even begin to tie their shoelace. So how's the question of will going to play out in this? So what's the place of chance, and what is game theory and this kind of episteme of game theory? What's the place of the players in it? That's the
Okay, good question. So you won't be surprised that even though there's a small philosophical literature on achievement, people in it disagree. And so actually a former student of mine here at the University of Toronto, Gwen Bradford, wrote a book about achievement, and she thinks that what determines the value of achievement is its difficulty in the sense of how much effort it takes. And so she thinks that in that sense, if a person with a disability ties a shoelace, where that would be require much more effort from them than it requires from us, that would be an achievement. So that is another conception of achievement with another conception of difficulty. Now, she thinks that's the only conception of difficulty. And so she imagines, she explicitly discusses some violin virtuoso who plays some incredibly complicated piece with utter ease, the Paganini Caprices, is that what it is? Effortlessly and flawlessly. And she says, well, that's not an achievement because it's not difficult. It's in the sense of involving effort. I say it's an achievement because it's difficult in the sense of involving complexity and so on. So there are two different understandings of difficulty possible. I was just talking about the one. I've got nothing against the other. There's a different conception of achievement, but I don't want it to be the case that the effortless, flawless execution of some tremendously complicated violin piece is not an achievement because it's effortless. I mean, I said to her once, your view implies that Tiger Woods' achievements in golf were over once he finished training himself. Actually, winning the tournaments, since that was easy, that's not an achievement. It was just learning how to play. As for chance, so I think I mentioned, I didn't think that the best life could consist in playing Go Fish and bingo. But games of chance, pure games of chance, why do people play them? Because they're exciting. I mean, you want to find out how they turn out. So there's kind of pleasure and enjoyment in waiting, for the determination of chance. And sports, I don't know how much luck there is in chess, but there's a lot of luck in baseball. I mean, you hit a screaming line drive and it's right at the shortstop. And that's luck. And so many games will have elements of skill and elements of luck. And I think they're more entertaining if they have some elements of luck rather than being totally a matter of skill. But they wouldn't be much fun to watch if they were totally a matter of luck. Can I tell another anecdote? So Scottish golf courses, like the old course at St. Andrews, are full of all these little stupid mounds and humps. So you can hit a ball right down the middle of the fairway. It'll hit the side of a bump of one of these little knobs and bounce into the gorse where you can't find it. And American golfers didn't like that because they thought you were able to control the game and determine your score. And you know, the course guides at the old course at St. Andrews will say it reflects the Presbyterian, the Scots Presbyterianism, and the idea that your fate is not in your hands. There are greater powers, greater Calvinist powers that determine what happens in your life, and you shouldn't pretend otherwise. But yeah, so I think, you know, if it were totally a matter of skill, the underdog would never win. But we want to watch a game where the underdog might win, and they might win if there's an element of luck. So, you know, as a concession to my English department friends, when you play a game or watch a game, there's a certain kind of narrative structure to what's going on, and a kind of narrative pleasure you can get from what happens. And sometimes that's heightened if luck has a role. Yeah.
Thank you. Natalie, I saw your hand.
Yes, well, I wanted to pursue a little bit the idea of chance as being the external force, you know,
Mhm.
whether you can control or not control the external force, and so on. But it also brought to me another aspect which you mentioned, which is it has to be voluntary. You have to want to, and you have to be a volunteer. So if you are forced to play baseball in phys ed, is that not a game anymore? You know, is that why? You know, it goes back to the idea that you know the businessman that says yes, you're as workers you're all forced to play that game. Is that no longer a game? Is that?
So, I mean, I may have gone over that too quickly, but then I didn't want to laboriously discuss what.
Slide that it has to be voluntary.
Well, it has to, the voluntary, so that's what's ambiguous. So my little contribution to this topic is that there are different understandings of the losery attitude. Does it depend on what your motive is? Remember I said the most permissive view says you're playing the game so long as you accept the rules, no matter what your motive is. And then I thought there was this other one where you count as playing the game only if you accept the rules because they make achieving the goal more difficult and you want to meet a challenge. And what I said was, with respect to the pure professional golfer, it can't be a necessary condition of your being somebody who's playing a game that you accept the rules just because you want to do something difficult. But I said, well, look, maybe we should think more sociologically. So something is a game if in this community, most people or many people who engage in the activity accept the rules because they want to meet the challenge that the rules impose. So that's why the pure professional golfer is playing golf, because most people who play the game accept the rules because they want to meet that challenge. And, you know, with respect to baseball, I think, you know, my sister was volleyball in junior high gym. She hated it. She wasn't playing it because she wanted to meet the challenge that volleyball imposes. But I would say volleyball counts, she counted as playing a game of volleyball because although she didn't have that attitude, the people who invented the game of volleyball and most people who play it because they want to meet the challenge. Now to go to the workers, Charlie Chaplin, you know, on the assembly line in modern times, he's not doing it because he wants to meet a challenge. And it's not the case that most people who work on an assembly line are doing it because they want to meet a challenge. I think that's true of most jobs. Now, I think actually academics and teachers, aren't we partly motivated by the fact that teaching and research and so on are challenging? And that's part of our motivation. But I don't think it makes our jobs a game because most people don't do their jobs for that reason.
I think you've been trying to ask a
I want
question
to go
for
back to achievement and how much you think that recognition from a community plays a role in it. So, and it goes back to cheating to a certain degree. I mean, you mentioned the chess person, if he's checkmated, that's it. But there are situations in which somebody could be checkmated, but it said, no, it wasn't, you didn't meet all the rules. Or some umpire or some regulation suggests, no, you didn't accomplish it, for whatever reason. I'm thinking of socio-political reasons. When you mentioned, and I'm sorry I'm going on and trying to explicate this, when you mentioned golf, immediately I thought of Trump. I mean, that's why I smile, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I've read the book. It's hilarious.
Because the guy, he accepts that he thinks he wins. He cheats, there's no question about it. That's part of what it is. But for him, it's all about recognizing himself as a winner and having others recognize him as accomplishing or achieving whatever it was. And the particular group within which he worked, which is his own golf club, recognized that as achievement. They put it down in the book that he's achieved the top score in some of his golf clubs in that year. I bring these up only because I think recognition is a really important part of what achievement is, certainly within a community. It goes back to the tying the shoelace by somebody who's disabled and may not even be in the community that recognizes that it's an achievement.
So I would first want to say there are many people who've accomplished difficult things and have not been recognized for them because the culture didn't value what they were doing. I want to insist that their achievements were still valuable even though they weren't recognized. I would want to insist on that. It's also true that many people, I mean, I think most of us in most of what we do have multiple motives for doing anything we do. And so I think that's, I'm going to go to the business guy at the end. I think most business people have multiple motives for what they do. So some of them, he says, it's a game where we keep score in dollars. Now I think he's interested, he means keep score in dollars. That's how you determine whether you've won or lost, whether you've played well or not played well. But many business people like keeping score in dollars because that's their status. They get to be on the Forbes, the Forbes 500. So if you've read the Commander-in-Chief book about Trump's incredible cheating at golf, I mean, he's got a cart that goes faster than anybody else's. He'll drive up the fairway, find his ball in the rough, throw it on the fairway, find your ball in the fairway and throw it in the rough. And then he'll say he won and you owe him money.
And the community recognizes it.
They do and they don't.
Not the readers of the book necessarily, but within that small community.
Well, all the caddies know that he cheats. In any case, but that's he's. Yeah. So, but so he's playing, people play for status and recognition. And the very things that enable you to succeed in a game or to complete an achievement may win you status and recognition. That's the keeping score in dollars. And, different people have different motives. I have no doubt, actually, I'm quite sure that, all the gazillionaires in the world are motivated very much by having more money than the other gazillionaires, and they want to be at the top of the list. But I think, so they are motivated by recognition, but I think they can also be, and some people are motivated largely by just the challenge for its own sake, apart from the recognition. And just one thing about Trump, I said that Suits's view was that if you're breaking the rules, then you're not playing the game. Now, I said in the case of baseball, if you're framing pitches to fool the umpire, there's no rule that you're breaking. But if you're throwing your opponent's ball in the rough, there's a rule that you're breaking. And, Suits would say Trump is not playing golf. When I was at the Institute, I had hosted a conference on games, and then there was a volume of essays published, a very good paper by Peter King, who was here before, but left, maybe in disgust. But one of the papers was about cheating, and it tried to make it look as it can't be the case that every time you break one tiny rule, you're not playing the game. Now, maybe Trump is breaking such central rules that he's not playing golf, but if you did.
But it's the recognition of achievement by a community. What I'm asking you, it sounds like you're defining, or your sense of what an achievement is real. It's based in a reality. Right?
Yeah.
It has to be real and not just something that's recognized by.
Yeah, I was assuming that.
There's an argument, obviously, about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm assuming that the achievement has to be real. I thought you were saying that somehow it only counts as an achievement if it's real and recognized. I think if it's recognized, that's an extra good thing, perhaps, but it's not essential to the nature of the achievement. I might have misunderstood you, but certainly if you claim to have won a certain tournament, I mean, Trump claimed to have won a tournament at his club that he didn't play in. He said, well, given the scores, everybody else's scores, I would have won if I'd played. So write me down as the winner of the tournament. That's my. That is. I hate to say it. That he did not win the tournament, and it doesn't matter what it says in Bedminster.
Stand up and speak.
Does it apply to?
Animals. I was thinking about if your set of criteria would apply to animals. It would seem that wild animals hunting would be aiming for achievement, but they're very much motivated by necessity and efficiency. And then you have the pet dog that would play fetching the ball with its owner. So I'm thinking about the role of games in domestication.
So, I would think that wolves hunting are not playing a game because they're trying to get their prey in the most efficient way possible. And actually, if you think about the losery attitude, it's quite complicated. It's a quite sophisticated attitude. You have to willingly accept rules that make it more difficult to achieve a goal because you want to engage in the activity of pursuing the goal by only those less efficient means. And I don't know much about animal psychology, but that's quite a lot of mental power that's required to have that thought. And likewise, when the dog is fetching the stick, it's not doing something in a less efficient way. I mean, I would say something interesting in Suits's book, that there's a difference between the concept of game and the concept of play. It's not the case that any time you're playing a game. Because if you think about a kitten playing with a ball of wool, or a dog just running around, you might say it's playing. But it's not playing a game because there aren't rules, and it's not accepting rules that restrict, that forbid efficient means to a goal. And he says, I think he said this to me more in correspondence. So there's sort of famous writings about games. There's a book by a Dutch historian, Johan Huizinga, called Homo Ludens, published in 1939, I think. And there's a book by a French sociologist, philosopher, Roger Caillois, called, I forget what it's called, but it's from the 50s. Do you know what it's called? Anyways, but he thinks their problem is that they're writing in German or French. Because German and French don't have different words for play and game. It's jouer and jeu, it's spielen and spiel. So they're inclined to assimilate all instances of play to playing a game. They have a category of the ludic that includes many things that aren't games, like putting on a theatrical production, conducting a criminal trial, conducting a religious service. They count all of those as ludic and in the same category as gameplay. But this analysis says, games have a very specific type of rule, and you have a very specific type of attitude towards them. And it's not the case, I'm running together two different things, but it's not the case that everything that we'd call play counts as playing a game. So animals certainly play. A kitten will play with a ball of wool. But I don't think it's playing a game because it's not following rules that restrict means to a goal. I could be wrong. I mean, maybe dolphins do play, but can play games.
The gentleman over there, then Tamara. Then we might have to let Tom off the hook.
What would you say about games that don't have rules of which it's possible to run afoul? Instead, they have limitations such that in the normal course of playing what seems to be the game, right, you are taking those limitations. So I'm thinking of video games sort of like this, right? And you can imagine
Yeah. So that's a good question. Suits actually discusses it in connection with mountain climbing, because when Hillary climbed Everest, he was not taking a more difficult means to the top than some other that he could have taken. I assume Hillary took the easiest route up that was possible for him at the time. In that case, the difficulty is set by the physical characteristics of Everest. As in a computer game, the difficulty is set by what the program allows you to do and what it doesn't. And what he says about Everest, about mountain climbing, is he just appeals to the losery attitude. It's true that Hillary was taking the most efficient means up the mountain, but if there had been a more efficient means, he wouldn't have taken it. So I said there's all these whimsical examples. He imagines Hillary getting to the top of Mount Everest, and there's a young woman up there. And she says, well, didn't you know there's an escalator that goes up the back side of the mountain? And then he would say, well, I wouldn't want it to know. I mean, if I'd known there was one there, I wouldn't have wanted to take it, because it's not difficult and it's not a challenge. And so that sort of is the term parametric difficulty. So the situation makes it difficult. It's not that there are rules that you could break if you wanted, but you decide not to. It's the situation itself makes it difficult. So in those cases, Suits would say you're playing a game if, counterfactually, if there were a more efficient way, you wouldn't use it. And could I finish with an entertaining anecdote from the book? So he imagines somebody saying, well, look, can't there be a game with no rules? And he tells this long story about a retired Russian and a retired Turkish general, who live in the same resort, rien à faire. The French speakers, rien à faire, in a resort on the Black Sea. And they were generals, and they were the kind of generals who didn't like all the rules that would be sent from the general staff way behind the lines. The morality of war says you mustn't do this and you mustn't do that. They just wanted to fight in whatever way would win. And they're playing chess, Ivan and Abdul. And they don't like the fact that there are all these rules in chess. They try to knock each other's pieces off the board and glue their pieces to the, I'm going to glue your king to the spot. That's how I'm going to checkmate you. I have to say, by the way, again, if you don't know this is based on a 19th century poem about Abdullah Bulbul Amir and Ivan Skavinsky-Skavar, which was written by somebody after one of the wars between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And it was popular enough in the 20th century that there are YouTube clips of people singing songs to it as if they sang in camp. And there's a late 1940s cartoon based on it. From Looney Tunes or Merry Melodies or one of those things. So anyway, so they decided that they just don't like these rules of games. So there's only one thing for us. There's only one thing we can do. A fight to the death with no rules. A fight to the death, no holds barred, no rules. Anything you want to do, you can use to kill your opponent. So they go off to their respective rooms and they're asleep, and the spirit of games comes to each of them in the middle of the night and says, wake up, wake up. Ivan or Abdul is sleeping. You can run over to his room, stab him, and you win the game. And each of them says, I can't do that. The fight to the death with no rules doesn't start until 8 in the morning. So there is a rule. Maybe that's a note on which to end.
Thank you so much, Tom.
This is good and bad attitudes. Number 2 and number 4 are the same.
Which?
In your slide with good and bad attitudes, number 2 and number 4 are the same.
Number